Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Colorado State University Prevention Extension Cast. I'm Dr. Nathaniel Riggs. I'm the Executive Director of the CSU Prevention Research Center, and I'm happy to be joined by Drs. Brad Connor and Mark Prince, who are Prevention Center faculty affiliates from CSU's Psychology Department. I hope that both of you are doing well today, and thanks for joining. So for those of you who have yet to join us for a Prevention Extension Cast, I'll be moderating a 45-minute Q&A with Mark and Brad about youth cannabis use. After that, we'll have some time for our guests to respond to any questions that emerge from the audience. So throughout our conversation here today, please feel free to enter those questions that come to mind into the Teams chat live or Teams live chat, and I'll relay them to either Brad or Mark near the end of the cast. But before we get to all that, I'd like to thank the National Institute of Food and Agriculture for providing funding for the Prevention Extension Cast. In fact, this is the second of 12 casts that we'll be streaming over the next 2 years on prevention-related topics. And we really want to make sure that as many of these topics are driven by you, our audience. So if you wouldn't mind, take the next couple of minutes and please drop as many Prevention Extension Cast ideas that you can think of into the chat. You tell us what you want to learn more about, and we'll do our best to find someone to come in and talk to us about it. Now, as I mentioned, we're joined by Drs. Brad Connor and Mark Prince. Dr. Connor is an associate professor and the director of the Master's in Addiction Counseling program in CSU Psychology Department. Now, Dr. Connor's research focuses on the etiology and negative outcomes of sensation seeking, emotion dysregulation, and impulsivity across the lifespan. And these negative outcomes include drug misuse, risky sexual behavior, and delinquency in adolescence and young adulthood. Now, he uses advanced multivariate statistical techniques. In fact, both of our guests today are very methodologically inclined to understand the complex relations among genes, personality types, psychopathology, and risky behavior. And ultimately, the goal of Dr. Connor's research is to further understand how prevention and intervention effects may differ depending on genetic, personality, and environmental factors. So doing some really important research into the kind of the for whom do our interventions work best, which has implications for tailoring and adapting of prevention and intervention programs. Now, Dr. Prince is an assistant professor and the associate director of the Master's in Addiction Counseling program in CSU's Psychology Department. Now, his research focuses on identifying mechanisms of behavior change in addiction and on developing interventions targeting those mechanisms. So doing really important work on identifying the factors that interventions can target that ultimately lead to program effects. So answering questions about how our interventions work. So he also employs advanced statistical techniques to examine relationships among individual psychological factors and their interaction with important social contexts. Now, the overall goal of Dr. Prince's work is to develop effective treatment approaches for those individuals seeking help for substance use problems. Now, thank you both for joining us today. And let's get started. We'll start with a question for Dr. Connor. Dr. Connor, to set the stage, can you tell us what the prevalence of youth cannabis use is? So what's the magnitude of the public health issue of youth cannabis use?
Thanks for the question, Nate, and thanks for having me today. I appreciate it. I'm excited to be here. It's interesting because the data that we have is, comes from these large epidemiological studies, indicates that right now that cannabis use is at its highest or the highest it's been in a very long time. So what does that mean for adolescents in high school or in middle and high school? We know that somewhere between 6% and 22% report past month use, and that depends on grade. So 8th graders, about 6 to 6.5% report past month use. When you get to 12th grade, that's around 22 to 23%. And then that number increases when you look at past year use. So about 11% or 12% of 8th graders and about 36% of 12th graders report past year use. And then roughly around 4% of adolescents in 12th grade are reporting daily use. So pretty frequent or high frequency use. And when you talk to the youth about how they use cannabis, about 87%, so the overwhelming majority indicate that they use cannabis by smoking it. And so, but I think that the most interesting thing to think about is why now is cannabis at its highest use rate in the last 20 to 30 years. And so when you look at a lot of that data, there seems to be some attribution to changes in legalization of both recreational and medicinal cannabis use around the United States, and then also the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic seems to have been driving increases in cannabis use among adolescents as well.
Okay, so you mentioned using frequently. What does problematic use look like for adolescents? It's
an interesting question when you ask about problematic use among adolescents. You know, the typical measure of problematic use for cannabis in general still relies on frequency. So the measurement of cannabis is not great in terms of understanding quantity or potency, but we usually get measures of frequency. And when we hear about individuals who are using daily or using multiple times per day, then we think about that as problematic use. We also can think about if an individual is using at home, alone, or in the mornings, and if they're not doing that for medicinal purposes, then we think about that potentially as problematic use. If they're using during school hours as well, we can think about that as being problematic use. And so, especially for individuals under the age of 15, there's a lot of research that suggests that if they're engaging in daily use, then they're likely causing damage to their brain that's going to be long-lasting or potentially permanent damage. Whether they stop smoking or they continue smoking, that damage is likely to occur. So there's a study that comes out of the Netherlands that looked at IQ scores over the course of the lifetime and showed that individuals under the age of 15 who reported daily use had a 10 to 12 point drop in their IQ score when IQ was measured 25 years later. But for individuals who started cannabis use after the age of 17, even if they engaged in high frequency use, daily use, or multiple times per day, they didn't show that same difference. They showed about a 1 to 2 point decrease in their IQ score over that same period of time. So there's some research that indicates that daily or high frequency use prior to the age of 15 can have permanent lasting effects on brain development that obviously causes us a lot of concern.
All right. Thanks for that, Brad. So you mentioned that a lot of the data comes from these large epidemiological nationwide studies. What do cannabis use rates look like in Colorado versus other states? It's
a good question. So we think about most of this data is not going to be specific to adolescents, but in general, the data suggests that Colorado ranks 4th in the United States in cannabis use frequency behind Washington, D.C., Vermont, and Oregon. When you look at adolescent use specifically, Colorado ranks 2nd among all states, with Vermont being the 1st. And so use is high here, and this is a state where cannabis use is fairly frequent among adolescents and college students as well.
Okay, great. And Brad, quickly, we have a question in the Q&A from Ms. Parker. Can you please repeat the study information where you found where the study came from?
The IQ study data. Wait, I have to. The IQ study data comes from a study out of the Netherlands. Nate, when you pinged a question on Mark, I'll pull up the study and put a link in the chat for people so they can see that study. Great,
thank you very much. So, kids from all sorts of demographic backgrounds and characteristics can use cannabis, obviously, and do. But are there any particular groups of young people who are more or less likely to use cannabis than others? So that was to Brad.
Yeah, there are some specific subgroups. We still see gender differences in use rates where boys or men are more likely to use at higher frequency than girls or women. The data on individuals who don't identify as men or women is a little bit hard to piece through right now, but primarily we see that individuals with who identify as boys or men tend to use at higher rates. Individuals with lower SES and also individuals who identify as being from any number of minoritized groups based on race or ethnicity are still showing higher rates of use than individuals who identify as white, non-Hispanic, and cisgender and heterosexual. So, and we also see that they experience the minoritized groups tend to experience consequences at higher rates than non-minoritized groups as well.
All right, great. Thank you, Dr. Connor. All right, to Dr. Prince now. So Dr. Connor had mentioned that the majority of young people smoke flower as a delivery system or how they consume cannabis, but how have the ways in which youth consume cannabis changed over the past 20 years?
Thanks, Nate, and thanks for having me here today. There's been a lot of changes, I think, primarily in the development of new products and in recreationally legal states like Colorado, the availability of concentrated cannabis products. So these, people may have heard them as dabs or wax or shatter. There's a lot of different types of preparation that essentially takes the cannabis flower and concentrates it through a chemical process and extracts out very high potency THC products that can be inhaled in a number of ways. We see increases in vaping, where you can create oils to put in a vape pen, or like I said, these dabs or different concentrated cannabis products that can be smoked out of a pipe or rolled into a joint with flour, or used on particular like water pipes that deliver much higher doses of cannabis than people have used in the past. There's also a huge proliferation of edible and topical products available, and those range in potency as well, from a standard dose being maybe 10 milligrams of THC up to sometimes hundreds of milligrams. And I think for adolescents that may not be able to go into dispensaries and buy product themselves, it's really important to know what you're using and to be careful with some of these newer preparations, because even a small amount can have a really strong effect. And I think, and even coming back to the cannabis flower, 20 years ago, average potency was probably around 10 to 12% THC, where now the high potency cannabis flower can be up to 30% THC, and concentrated cannabis products can be well over 90% THC. I think beyond that, the other things we're starting to see more and more of show up in the market are products that contain other cannabinoids like CBD or CBN. There's less known about these products. Some are touted to have various medicinal purposes, but the research is still out on that. There is some evidence that shows having a more balanced product that maybe is equal parts THC and CBD may protect against some anxiety or psychosis related effects, but again, that science is still emerging.
So you mentioned the high potency of some ways to administrate or to consume cannabis. How does that relate potentially to overdose or using too much? I don't think folks really heard of people overdosing on cannabis products 20 years ago, but with these higher potency delivery systems, is overdose a thing? And if so, what does that look like? Yeah,
so I think that raises a few points. One is the risk for accidental ingestion. A lot of the edible products, they look like gummy bears or candy bars, and sometimes, especially for youth, if their parents or guardians leave them out or leave them around, they'd be easy to eat, and that is really scary for these kids. The question about whether or not it's dangerous, I think, I'm not a medical doctor, but for the most part, what happens if you eat too much or use too much in another way is feeling a lot of anxiety, potentially some temporary psychosis related experiences. There's been more and more reports of cannabis-induced hyperemesis, which is uncontrolled vomiting syndrome, in which case people can become very dehydrated. Typically, really what people need when they've taken too much is time for their body to metabolize the cannabinoids, and typically there aren't long-lasting effects, but there have been some cases where people have gotten relatively sick and need medical attention. One of the things that we always recommend to parents is to treat their edible cannabis products the same way you would treat guns. So lock them up, get a small safe, or make sure that they're out of reach, because there are legal consequences even if your kids accidentally get a hold of them, and it can be a pretty scary and uncomfortable experience for everyone involved. So I don't know if that exactly answers your question. You don't see cannabis overdoses the way you think of a heroin overdose or an alcohol overdose per se. It doesn't have the same effects, but it's definitely easier now than it's ever been to take too much, to feel really scared and uncomfortable, and in extreme cases to need medical attention.
Great, thanks, Mark. So you mentioned that youth can vape cannabis. They can also vape nicotine. Can you tell can you tell the difference between vaping cannabis or vaping nicotine, and what might be some tips for parents or adults in keeping an eye open for these more covert ways of using cannabis?
That's such a good question. Well, first of all, youth and anyone can vape nicotine, can vape cannabis products. They also mix them together. A couple of years ago, there was a lot of new headlines about people having a lipid-based pneumonia that came from vaping, sometimes referred to as popcorn lung. And a lot of this comes from black market cannabis oils that were essentially, they're mixed with vitamin E oil, which has a similar combustion temperature, and really doesn't have much taste or smell, but it's similar to cutting cocaine or heroin with a product that may have a numbing agent in it that to spread the product further. And so I think I think some of the other questions we may get to later about prevention strategies involves talking to your kids about what they're using. And really one advantage of the recreational market are the controls placed on labeling and testing products. And so if they're using real products that they bought from dispensaries, even if they didn't buy them themselves, they're probably safer than products bought on the street. The other thing, coming back to your question of how can you tell, an important aspect of the modern cannabis market are terpenes, and these are compounds that have taste and smell profiles that are actually found in everyday foods, and the manufacturers build these into vaping cartridges to give users the experience of having a certain taste or smell. Although this is also true for nicotine products, although those many times have rather than being designed to taste like cigarettes, taste like melon or mint or something like that, where the cannabis products tend to have more of a taste or smell that you would associate with cannabis. And so one thing is you might still be able to smell the vaping to tell. You can also pay attention to your child's behaviors. Nicotine doesn't have much of an intoxicating effect, where cannabis does. And so if someone is having trouble concentrating or sleepy, those sorts of things might indicate that they've been using cannabis and not nicotine. And the other issue is tolerance. We've been shocked as we've done field research to see how much cannabis people can use and still carry on a normal conversation, appear fairly normal. And I think with vaping in particular, where people use small amounts, dozens of times a day, they get really used to using it. And so for people that use it very high frequency, high concentrated products, as their tolerance increases, it can become pretty difficult. And that's why we always recommend just trying to have as safe and open of a conversation as you can. And encourage your kids to talk to you about it.
Great, thanks, Mark. At this point, I'd just like to remind everybody that there is a Q&A chat. For those of you who aren't familiar with Teams, there is a couple of thought bubbles up on the top right of your screen, and one of them has a question mark in it. That's the Q&A, and feel free to drop any questions you have in the Q&A. All right, so back to Dr. Connor. You alluded to some of this in your previous questions, but one question that I have for you is why are we concerned with youth cannabis use, and why should we be more focused on youth use than adult use, or should we?
It's a good question. I do think we should be, for a couple of reasons. One, the study that I referenced, which is now in that Q&A, if you want to click on that link, that shows there's some significant differences depending on when an individual starts using cannabis. It's pretty well known that the earlier in life a person starts using substances, the more likely they are to experience negative consequences from that use. So we always want to pay attention to that. But even when we think about baseline, data, where we're at in adolescence, if individuals are in puberty or they're still growing, then anything that they do that introduces toxins into their system could have negative impact on that, right? So, there's a fairly common perception that cannabis is not harmful. However, if you think about it at its basic element, our lungs are designed to do one thing, and that's breathe air. And the minute that our lungs are doing anything other than breathing air, then they're potentially incurring damage. And so, if we think about what that damage may look like as an individual still developing and still growing, it's likely to have a more significant impact on those individuals. So that's one point. The other point, like I said in the first answer, is there's some research evidence that suggests that earlier use and higher frequency use at younger ages can lead to long-term changes in brain structure and function that could result in reduced IQ score over time that doesn't seem to bounce back. That's a pretty significant concern. We also see some links between adolescent cannabis use and first onset of psychotic episode for individuals who may be predisposed to have psychosis. So there's some connection between cannabis use and psychosis, especially in adolescence, that's not really well understood, but could serve as a pretty significant risk for adolescents who are predisposed to psychosis. And then you see changes to, like I said, socio-emotional functioning that are coinciding with a fairly significant disruption in life. I don't know if any of the attendees have ever raised an adolescent, but adolescents are already pretty hectic and have a lot of things going on. And when you throw in the mix using substances that are going to change mood, they're going to affect sleep, they're going to affect diet and overall health, then you can expect that it's going to create even more significant struggles.
Okay. So you mentioned some negative effects on lung development. What are some other mental or physical health problems that are related to youth cannabis use?
Yeah, there's some evidence to suggest that youth cannabis use can do things like stunt physical growth over time. So individuals who start using at younger ages and who use at higher frequency don't seem to get as big or grow as tall or have the same height parameters as individuals that don't report that use. There's also instances of individuals who show differences in cognitive strategies, the way they solve problems, the way they're able to regulate their emotions. And so here we're talking not about being dysregulated, but having the strategies necessary to regulate emotion, to recognize the emotion someone's experiencing, and to understand when it's too intense and try to find ways to lower that intensity. We also see changes in the brain that may lead to higher impulsivity, more likely to take risks and engage in risk-taking behavior more broadly. All of these things seem to coincide with earlier onset of cannabis use and higher frequency use.
All right, thanks. All right. Well, thanks for setting the stage on the etiology of cannabis use among youth. Dr. Prince, both the Prevention Research Center and the Addiction Counseling Program, we're really invested in reducing cannabis use and misuse. And in prevention, there are several evidence-based approaches to preventing cannabis use and substance use more generally speaking. There are registries of these programs, and there are several school-based preventive interventions and family-focused preventive interventions. For those in the audience, if you're interested in exploring what those programs might be, you can go to the Blueprints for Healthy Youth Development website, and there's over 100 model and promising evidence-based preventive interventions that communities can choose from. But we obviously can't prevent every young person from using, and ideally these prevention strategies are well integrated and complemented by strategies to help youth reduce or quit cannabis use if they're already using and or using too much. Can you tell us what the kind of state of the science is on some of those treatment strategies and what they are and how families can take advantage of them?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's been a lot of work done in this area, and Brad and I were just talking recently about doing a need for our updated meta-analysis on some of these types of interventions. There was a Cochrane review article by Gates and colleagues in maybe about 5 years ago that reviewed psychosocial interventions for cannabis use disorder. And interestingly, many of the interventions were able to reduce cannabis use rates, but very few were able to reduce consequences, which raises that bigger question about the link between use and consequences. The interventions that were able to reduce cannabis-related consequences really relied on cognitive behavioral and motivational interviewing-based strategies. And these are broad, but a lot of times this involves things like providing personalized normative feedback or just personalized feedback in general. So having someone report how much they're using, how often, and then also their perceptions about how much people around them are using and other people's attitudes, and then giving that information back to them and having a conversation around things that might be surprising. Maybe in that conversation, they learn that other people use less than they thought they did, or other people were less accepting of cannabis use than they thought they were. A lot of times building just some insight around how much someone's actually using and what others around them are using and find acceptable can go a long way. Another thing is identifying key strategies that they can use and tailoring those strategies to the context they're in. So if someone's at a party, it might be best for them just to pass a joint if it gets handed to them, or when someone starts smoking, to pretend to take a phone call and step outside. Or if they're home alone or they're feeling sad or depressed, that maybe to reach out, have a conversation, engage in a healthier activity than doing drugs. And so as much as possible, I think especially for adolescents, making it so they feel safe to have a conversation, to have real strategies in place that are less punishing and more focused on harm reduction goes a long way. And to try to be as realistic as possible, give them means to have a designated driver, to have drug-free activities that they can engage in and safe spaces to do those things. So, all of those fit within the broader context of these empirically supported treatments that fall into a cognitive behavioral or motivational interviewing based framework. Typically, there's some psychoeducation, some amount of feedback, and then some skills training involved to have the best outcomes.
Great. Yeah. So I know some of those things that you mentioned. I know that a lot of your work is in the space of protective behavioral strategies. So just wondering, you mentioned having those conversations. What are some of the ways that adults, again, whether they be parents or teachers, other caregivers, can really arm youth with those skills to remember to use the protective behavioral strategies and increase the likelihood that they'll use them?
Yeah, I think a lot of times what happens as kids transition into adolescence is the lines of communication can break down a little bit, that in families, people can become isolated, on their devices and their social groups. And, there's just less kind of dinner table conversation maybe than there used to be. And as kids are involved in activities and so are parents, it can just be hard to find time to connect. And so, even a small amount of time, 30 minutes a day, or even, sitting down together once a week to just have a conversation, if that's something that can be part of a normal routine, it can create a safe space to have conversations about, what's going on around them. What are their friends using? What are they using? Or do they have questions? Are they afraid of getting in trouble? Planning with them. What do you do if someone uses too much? Having conversations about getting help and, kind of what the plan will be, or if you end up in a place where you need to get home safely. My advice is just to be as direct as possible, and it's better to have these conversations ahead of time than like in the moment when someone might be intoxicated or just went through a really tough experience, saw a friend in a rough spot or been in a rough spot themselves. A lot of times those aren't the moments to have the conversation. We talk about strike when the iron is cold in these situations. So, even if you pick your child up, or, you're a teacher and someone comes and talks to you when something is, had just happened, to just revisit that later and then prepare in the future, so that everyone can be ready to make good choices. I don't know if that exactly answers your question.
Yeah, it did. Yeah, thank you. Great. So, Dr. Connor, as most of us all know, Colorado was one of the first 2 states, along with my home state, Washington State, to legalize adult retail cannabis sales. How do legalized retail cannabis policies affect the perception of cannabis use and/or use itself, if at all?
It's a really good question, and it's a complicated question to answer. One of the things that the group that I work with has done very recently is look at the Healthy Kids data out of Colorado to try to determine if there's a relation between frequency of cannabis use and where adolescents are obtaining cannabis use. And so if you look at that's one of these large epidemiological data sets. If you look at that data set, it asks where youth are particularly getting their cannabis, and it asks about from dispensaries or marijuana shops, getting it from adults over the age of 21, getting it from individuals under the age of 21, so on and so forth. We ran analyses, we're in the process of writing this up, that showed that adolescents in Colorado in 2019 said that there's a, sorry, let me start that over again. Adolescents in Colorado in 2019 who report high frequency cannabis use report that they're most likely to get their cannabis from cannabis dispensaries. I don't know how they're getting it. That's one of the downsides of these large epidemiological studies, is we can't drill into that information any further, but we see this significant association between high frequency use in the Healthy Kids data set and accessing cannabis through cannabis dispensaries. So to answer the question, my guess is that, if you live in a state where recreational cannabis is legal, then it's going to be easier for everyone to get access to that cannabis. We saw some really interesting trends once Colorado and Washington legalized, where perception of harm of cannabis in Colorado really didn't change all that much, and was already pretty low. Coloradoans in general don't think cannabis is that harmful, and so we didn't see a lot of movement over time on that variable. There was more movement in Washington, where after legalization they showed a pretty sharp decline in perceptions of harm of cannabis use following legalization, and a lot of the thinking there is that, if the state's going to legalize cannabis for recreational use, then it must not be bad for you, which is not good thinking. We know that there are many substances that are legal that have significant negative health effects. Tobacco, alcohol, among probably the 2 most prevalent. But we get this, we got some of this information from the population that suggests that, that cannabis must not be harmful if we're going to be able to use it legally, for recreational purposes. So that's a long answer to your question, but basically, in general, in states where there is a higher perception that cannabis is harmful, as legalization comes through, you see some decrease in that. In states where people already don't think cannabis is all that harmful, there really isn't a lot of change. we really need to be paying attention to how adolescents are accessing the cannabis that they're using, especially if they're getting it from dispensaries. Then we may need to figure out how they're doing that.
Great. Thank you for that. That's interesting to know. Mark, so many in the audience are college students. Recent advances in developmental neuroscience show us that the brain continues to develop up until the age of 25, especially in really important areas of the brain responsible for decision making and regulation. We also know that going to college is a really important transition in a young person's life, and that cannabis use peaks during those years. Can you tell us about any resources that are available either through CSU or outside of CSU that can support college students who may be using cannabis more than they'd like to be?
Yeah, it absolutely is a critical time where cannabis use is really high. It's available. Many people consider it just part of the college experience. Here at CSU, we do engage with the Cannabis eCheckup to Go, and Nate and Brad and I have all done a couple clinical trials looking at the efficacy of that program. And there's some promising effects, definitely some good information to be learned. Here on campus, we have the Psychological Services Center that our doctoral students train in. They're supervised by myself and Brad and other addictions faculty, and many of the students are very well trained in treating substance use problems broadly and cannabis specifically. We also have both undergrad and graduate training programs in addiction counseling. So we have many great referral sources in the community to well-trained addiction counselors at various levels, depending on the severity of the problem. So in general, Fort Collins, I think, has a lot of resources in part because of the training programs offered here. We're also always developing new treatments in my lab, and every so often we enroll for those and have student-led projects and projects that I'm leading that are testing out new treatment strategies that are based on pulling together state-of-the-science processes. And so it's always hard to know how to reach people. We put up flyers, send out emails, and do online recruitment. But there's a lot of resources going on, and also if anyone's struggling, please reach out to me and I can help connect you to those resources.
Great, thanks. Yeah, so you mentioned the Cannabis eCheckup to Go. You've been partnering on. Can you tell our audience a little bit more about that and what that entails?
Yeah, so this is a web-based intervention developed by folks at San Diego State University. And the advantage of a web-based intervention is there's a lot of barriers to coming in person. Everything from transportation to stigma, where the web-based interventions can be done at home or in any safe place. And they use a lot of the strategies I mentioned earlier. So if you participate in it, the first thing that happens is you fill out a survey talking about your own use and your attitudes and your beliefs about others' use. And then you step through a handful of pages that give you a bunch of information about the actual use rates and beliefs and attitudes among your peers, and some really helpful strategies to just manage your use. It's very non-judgmental, it's anonymous, and it's a good way to just gain information, learn skills that you can use, and be more equipped to make good choices in your life. And I think, for college students in particular, as they become more independent and autonomous, they just need to make good choices, and I think the eCheckup to Go can give some good tools to help with that. One other thing that we've seen in our lab, that is related to one of the questions in the chat about how youth cannabis use has changed during COVID. We haven't published this yet, but we're working on writing it up, is a stronger relationship between cannabis use and existential anxiety, which comes primarily from 4 sources. Freedom, so with increased freedom comes increased responsibility, which can be anxiety provoking. Meaning, like dealing with meaning and feelings of meaninglessness, isolation, and death. All of these things have become so much more pronounced during COVID, and we're finding that more and more young people are reporting using cannabis to cope with these existential issues than they were before COVID. So just to throw that out there, that, and you know, if you or someone you know is struggling with those kind of big issues, those are great things to talk about in therapy, and we have great therapists at the Psychological Services Center, at the Health Network, and other places in town that can help, you know, just sort of sort through these things, make sense of them, and find healthier ways to cope with those feelings.
Great. So that actually transitions well into a question from the audience that I think would be, we can just send that to you right now. The question is, are there any insights related to youth cannabis use during the COVID-19 pandemic and how it might look different than cannabis use prior to the pandemic?
Yeah, so you know, in my work, that's one of the things that I've seen as a major difference. Is the reasons people are using, in part, are to cope with the stresses and kind of existential concerns that have emerged in the pandemic. Also, I think we don't quite know yet because the data is still being collected, is still coming out. We're still in it, right? And so it's really hard to say. I think with many health behaviors, I'm sure everybody knows someone that lost 50 pounds in the pandemic and someone else who gained 50 pounds in the pandemic. And the same is true with substances, right? There's some people that use this as an opportunity to let go of these habits, and other people that have really gone deep into them. And I think as we all kind of grapple with this issue, you know, existential threat we're all facing, we deal with it in different ways. But, you know, there's some preliminary data that there's increases in use, but I just don't think the science is there yet to say exactly what we're dealing with in this regard. And Brad, I don't know if you've seen anything else in your lab that we haven't talked about yet here.
Brad, do you have any?
I was waiting for it to show that I was live before I talked.
Go ahead.
I think that Mark makes a good point that the data is mixed. You know, the data from the larger epidemiological studies is pointing to these significant increases, especially among college students, and linking them to COVID. But I don't know. I mean, those, like I said, those epi studies, they don't really allow us to drill into why those associations may be occurring. And so I think we need some time, you know, to really better understand the data and see what's going on. I'd leave it there.
Okay. So that is also transitions to another question on the Q&A around COVID-19, and let me see if I can find it. Where did that go? Maybe it got published. The question, if I remember correctly, was around does the COVID-19 pandemic provide any kind of unique opportunities that maybe weren't there around cannabis use reduction or prevention?
Yeah, I can answer that if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. Yeah,
so you know, one of the things that may end up being sort of I'll call it a gray lining instead of a silver lining of COVID-19 has been the rapid expansion of telehealth and video health, or e-health, which I think benefits all segments of the population. We're able to provide services to individuals that live in rural communities far away from where we typically would do face-to-face services. We can provide services to individuals who may have other difficulty traveling to treatment facilities. Youth increasingly are living in a virtual world anyway, so if we can reach them where they're at, that's a better way to do it. So we saw a lot of money coming out of the federal relief packages that allowed us to build up our telehealth resources, and hopefully those will stick around. Hopefully we'll see more of a hybrid model moving forward, where when individuals can't get services because they can't travel to them, rather than telling them they can't get services, we find a way to provide them virtually. So I think that's probably the best answer to that question. I don't know if Mark wants to add anything to that.
To the question of like what resources are available now during the pandemic that weren't before.
Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think even just the fact that we're doing this virtually and everyone has access and we're used to it and comfortable with it. You know, we've seen transitions into and out of telehealth to in-person in the clinic pretty seamless. I think that it's a great opportunity. It removes a lot of barriers and stigma for folks to seek help, to get treatment, and we should take every opportunity we can to take advantage of that, and you know, continue to provide these platforms as means to get mental health services in the future.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, so I guess we've kind of unofficially transitioned into the Q&A period of the of this prevention extension cast. We have a few more that are in the Q&A. Feel free. We've got another 15 minutes, so if you have remaining questions, go ahead and continue to drop them into the Q&A. This question I know is really relevant to some of the work that Brad's doing around promoting a behavioral health workforce. So, we can have as many evidence-based prevention and treatment strategies as we can develop. Like I said, there are registries full of these programs, but we also need professionals out in communities who can implement these evidence-based practices and programs with fidelity and in ways that are going to lead to impact. So do you have any insights, Brad, on how our crisis related to the lack of a behavioral health and mental health workforce that is an educational workforce that has only gotten more complicated with COVID might influence youth cannabis use prevention?
Yeah, it's another great question. When we started the addiction counseling training programs here at CSU, we already identified a fairly significant workforce shortage among individuals who were trained to treat substance use disorders and to work on prevention strategies, which is one of the reasons we created the programs that we did, that Mark and I are the director for. In general, prevention and intervention among individuals with substance use disorders is a tough job. You have to deal with a lot of tough stuff, for lack of a better way of saying it. It's really scientific, I know. And so you already see a lot of turnover, burnout, and leaving the profession to protect an individual's own mental health. So I think things are going to get worse before they get better. And I don't have a good answer for that. I mean, we've seen an increase in individuals returning to school to get trained, but that's going to take some time to work its way through the system. I think, I don't know. I think even same thing, like teachers are overworked, that the last thing that they have time to do is add more things to their schedule and more things to the things they're trying to do on a daily basis. So in general, I think things get worse before they get better. I don't know if that answers the question. And I know it's not very sunny or rosy, but that's what I see.
Can I add a little bit to that, Nate?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think, just an opportunity to put in a plug for our program here and other programs like ours is this workforce shortage has created so many well-paying jobs that are much needed in the community. We are literally having people from treatment centers come to our classes to recruit. We're getting emails. Local centers are getting grants to fund internships that were typically unpaid. And at undergrad, master's, doctoral level, all levels of clinicians, there's just such a big need. And so if you or anyone are thinking about going back to school or thinking about specializing, there's just such a huge need and great opportunities to work in this field if anyone's interested.
Great, thanks. Sorry, I am adding some stuff to the chat. And okay, so here we go with a question around, so this, I found this really interesting. I saw this yesterday as well. The Monitoring the Future study, which is one of the nationwide large-scale surveys that that we were referring to earlier on, came out and it showed the biggest single-year decline across all substances, and that seems to, here I'll publish the question here in a second, that seems to follow the preliminary Healthy Kids Colorado survey data from last year's post-pandemic. What do you make of that, Mark?
Yeah, I have not had a chance to read the report yet. I'm also the multiple principal investigator on a large survey of reservation-based youth, so youth living on or near Native American reservations. And so we actually, Richard Meek from Monitoring the Future is on our advisory board, and we've been doing some of this epi research. And an interesting question I have, and I need to look into their reports, is if there's been any drop off in the representativeness of the samples. I know that schools that are struggling the most have been, less inclined to participate during COVID because they have other issues going on. And I don't know if Monitoring the Future Healthy Kids has run into that the, schools that are kind of have weathered the storm easier than other schools are more likely to participate. But it may also be that those numbers really are representative of what's going on nationally, and it may be a issue of access, that when schools remote and people are distancing and movement is more restricted, that there's just less access to substances, and so people aren't using or aren't comfortable using with friends the way that they typically would, which may result in the declines. To me, I think any individual year gives us a snapshot of what's going on right now, but it's hard to say, if things open up, if the use rates will return or rebound. It's really interesting. I want to be optimistic about it, but at this point, it's hard for me to overinterpret those findings.
All right, great, thanks for that. Okay. Let's see here. There was a request to add your contact information. So if any of you are interested in the addiction counseling program, feel free to email Brad as the director. I'm sure Mark would also respond to your emails. There's a question about withdrawal symptoms. Are there withdrawal symptoms from youth coming off of high usage? And I guess I'll throw that one to Brad.
So typically what we see for any individual, adolescent or adult who's withdrawing from high frequency cannabis use is disruption to sleep patterns. Typically that means less sleep, not more, but some individuals will actually have hypersomnia. So we'll see sleep disturbance. We'll also see appetite disturbance. Again, for some individuals, that'll mean increased eating, and for other individuals, that'll mean significantly decreased eating. And then general disruption to mood, typically with individuals experiencing more anger and more sadness as they decrease their cannabis use and as they get farther away from that high frequency use. Individuals that reduce their use significantly can expect those symptoms to last anywhere from 10 to 16 days, but most individuals will see a resolution of those withdrawal symptoms at around that 16-day mark and a return to some level of baseline functioning. So sleep will return to what it was, or depending on how long they've been engaging in high frequency use, it may find a new normal. Same thing with appetite and mood. But those are the primary symptoms that we see in a withdrawal from high frequency cannabis use.
A question, I guess, let me see, I'll throw this one to Brad as well. Can you please comment on cannabis use and the impact on youth of color? Either of you, I guess, can cover that one, but I'll throw it to Brad first.
Sure. The data is not great here in terms of the amount of data we have, but the amount of data we do have suggests that youth of color who who use cannabis are likely to experience more negative consequences from that use than individuals, youth who are not of color, and it's not clear why that is. That's not likely to be anything related to their individual identity, but much more likely to be related to systemic factors. Individuals, people of color, are treated differently by the law, and so if you get in trouble with the law, you're likely to get stiffer consequences than individuals who identify as white. I don't know. I think I'll leave it there and throw it to Mark and see what he has to add.
Yeah, I agree. It's a really important issue. Not just racial or ethnic identity, but intersections of identity. By race, sign, sex, gender identity, sexual orientation. A lot of times we think about one of these identities at a time, but for most people, these identities work in concert, and it can be the combination of certain identities that lead to risk, and it's an area that's woefully understudied. We need more work that specifically is focused on identifying risk and resilience factors. I think another direction we need to go in for this type of research is focusing on strength and resilience rather than risk and problems. And we've started to do some of that work in my lab, and it just opens a really important avenue that I think hopefully in the next handful of years we'll see more and more studies that focus on intersectional identity and resilience and protective factors along with risk.
Great, thanks. So either of you, I guess, Mark, I'll start with you. So the Prevention Extension Cast is one way to get the word out to people when it comes to the consequences of cannabis use and etiology of cannabis use. What have you two found, or Mark, I'll start with you, are some effective ways at disseminating information about the impacts of cannabis to the community at large, parents and youth?
Yeah, I would say this is not a strength of mine, but I know that Brad has spoken to local high schools a number of years, and he can talk more about that. I've started to be more aware of academic Twitter and different Reddit options. So I think social media can be a way to spread the word, also word of mouth, and yeah, doing things like this that have a broader audience. I really appreciate this opportunity to come and talk about some of the things that we do. A lot of times I feel like I'm doing this work in a vacuum, and so I so appreciate the opportunity to talk about it.
Brad, do you have a follow-up for that?
Yeah, I do actually have a couple of follow-ups. So I do go to local high schools and often do presentations for parents and for the youth invited to talk to them about the impacts of cannabis use on adolescent development. We actually worked on a project, I still have it on my desk, the Cannabis Toolkit, that was supposedly was going to be distributed to higher education institutions, which talks about cannabis use and its impact on college students primarily. So this is a project that Mark, Nate, and I all worked on together. So there are resources like this. I think this is available digitally as well, but I actually have no idea. I hope it is. I think directing individuals to podcasts or webcasts like this is really good as well. I think we need to get better at it overall is my answer, though. I think we need to find ways to do a little more outreach and to get more into the community to provide that information. I think also to provide honest and accurate information. I think that oftentimes when I go to present, people have questions that I don't often anticipate that are sometimes very basic questions about, again, like where their kids are getting cannabis or whether they should be using cannabis in front of their kids. I think those are all important discussion points, obviously ones we don't have time to get into in too much detail today, but I think we need to also broaden the topics of conversation beyond sort of the standard, how does it impact the adolescent brain or different things, and talk about some of these sort of more pragmatic questions as well to help out parents and youth.
Great, thanks. All right, well, this has been a really informative webcast. I really appreciate both of you spending your time with us today on on this topic. I guess if you're interested in learning more about the addiction counseling program, I've dropped that information in the chat. I also dropped the Prevention Research Center's email in the chat if you're interested in partnering with the Prevention Research Center around youth cannabis use prevention. We work with communities and educators in providing training and technical assistance around prevention implementation. Also please contact me if you'd like to learn more about our Human Development and Family Studies Master's Program in Prevention Science or our doctoral program in Applied Developmental Sciences, where where our students get a really broad training in applied developmental science research methods. And so with that, I hope everybody has a nice rest of your day, nice rest of your week, and hope you have a nice and restful opportunity to have a break within the next couple of weeks. And we will see you in the new year. All right. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks so much, Nate.
Thanks, Nate. Thanks, everybody.